In the soft hush of the early colonial morning, long before the sun lifted its golden edge over the forests of New England or the tidewaters of Virginia, the world of early America stirred quietly into being. The still, dark sky hung low over timbered homes and muddy streets, the faint scent of hearth smoke curling gently through the air. Roosters had yet to crow. Chickens shuffled in their straw-filled corners. In these moments, the rhythms of life in colonial America were not grand or dramatic, but subtle and slow and bound by the cycles of the land and the will of the seasons. A woman in a coarse linen shift slipped quietly from her straw-stuffed mattress, the blanket of darkness still clinging to the corners of her wooden room. Her breath came out in small clouds as she reached for her woolen dress, the fabric rough against her skin, cold as it had been sitting near the unlit fireplace all night. She moved with practiced quiet, so as not to wake the children bundled together nearby on a shared mattress, their bodies curled like kittens beneath patched quilts and wool blankets that smelled faintly of smoke and old sweat. Downstairs, she stoked the hearth embers, coaxing them gently to life with dry kindling and the curled bark of birch trees. The fire hissed softly, a glow blooming orange and tender across the wide fireplace, illuminating iron pots, wooden spoons, and the simple tools of daily survival. Nearby sat the spinning wheel, the butter churn, and a bundle of corn husks saved for later use. Outside, the world was still dark, save for the faint starlight filtered through clouds and the silhouettes of barns, sheds, and outhouses looming like shadows. A man pulled on his breeches and shirt in a separate room, or perhaps across the hall, his body lean from labour, skin weathered by wind and sun. He moved methodically, his calloused hands reaching for leather shoes and a broad hat, already thinking of fences to mend, fields to plough, animals to feed, and debts to worry over. There was no time for lingering in warmth. The land demanded attention. The days were short, the work long, and the margin for error razor thin. In a coastal town, a child might be shaking off sleep to fetch water from a well before breakfast, balancing a wooden bucket with both hands, watching her breath in the chilly air as she walked the short path. Dirt pressed hard from many feet. In the countryside, another child gathered eggs from beneath hens, each egg still warm, nestled in hay, the gentle cluck of chickens echoing through the barn. The chores were woven into the fabric of childhood. There was no idle time, not really. If a child was old enough to walk steadily, they were old enough to carry kindling or sweep the hearth. Breakfast, when it came, was simple and unadorned. Porridge of cornmeal or oats, perhaps a bit of molasses if one was lucky. Bread, coarse and dense, baked days before, softened with broth or dipped in milk. Meat was rare in many households, saved for Sundays or days of celebration. Salted pork, when available, hung from rafters, or was buried beneath layers of salt in wooden barrels. Most families ate what they could grow, trade, or forage. Gardens were a lifeline, not a hobby, and every sprouting root or leafy green was the result of careful effort and constant tending. The midday hours passed slowly, filled with the familiar motions of colonial life. Men worked in fields with wooden ploughs drawn by oxen, sweat dampening their linen shirts beneath the midday sun. Soil, thick and resistant, broke reluctantly under the weight of blade and beast. Women preserved food, mended clothes, stirred pots hung over open flames, swept floors made of uneven planks, and occasionally visited with neighbours if they lived nearby enough to justify the journey. Shoes were not worn indoors unless necessary. Floors were often strewn with rushes or herbs to mask smells and absorb spills. Flies were ever present, buzzing lazily through kitchens, drawn to the smells of food and livestock. Windows, when they existed, were often made of oiled paper or small panes of glass, imported at great cost, letting in dim light but little warmth. In towns, life moved with slightly more bustle. Artisans, blacksmiths, coopers, and merchants tended to their shops and customers. Apprentices, usually boys in their early teens, learned their trades by watching, copying, and assisting. The smell of iron, of wood shavings, of leather, and pipe smoke lingered in the air. The streets were narrow and muddy, sometimes filled with waste and debris. Animals wandered freely, pigs rooting in gutters, chickens clucking through yards. Carts creaked over uneven roads. The sounds were constant but muted, like background music to a long, labouring day. Inside churches, where sermons could stretch for hours, people gathered on Sundays dressed in their best wool, sitting on hard wooden pews, listening with heads bowed. Faith permeated nearly every aspect of colonial life. It was both a source of comfort and control. Ministers often visited homes, and prayers were said morning and night. Births, deaths, illnesses, and crop failures were all framed within spiritual interpretation. The supernatural felt near, both in hope and fear. Superstition, too, coiled quietly through households. Folk remedies, charms, and signs were not uncommon, whispered about even as Bibles sat open on rough-hewn tables. As the afternoon faded into evening, candles were lit, made from tallow or beeswax, their light flickering and soft. Shadows danced along the walls, and the family gathered near the fire for what quiet they could claim. Food was eaten slowly, with gratitude and fatigue. Stories might be shared, or passages read aloud. Children sometimes played with corn-husk dolls or simple carved toys, before sleep beckoned them toward makeshift beds. Adults lingered a bit longer, perhaps mending tools or discussing news from nearby towns, rumours of conflict, strange illnesses, or letters sent months ago that had finally arrived. The weight of distance and delay was always felt, as even the smallest bit of information moved at the pace of horses, ships, or whispered word. Privacy was rare, rooms were shared, beds were often communal, lives overlapped closely, tied together by necessity and space. The sounds of the night came slowly, the creaking of beams, the soft rustle of wind against wooden walls, the distant howl of a dog, or the sharp call of a night bird. The day ended, not with sudden silence, but with a gentle fading of energy, a slipping into darkness that matched the soft hush of dawn. And beneath it all, the steady thrum of survival continued, quiet, resilient, and endlessly repeated across the colonies of early America. As the seasons shifted and the long shadows of autumn stretched across the colonies, daily life began to tilt into the rhythms of harvest and preparation. The air grew crisper, biting gently at the fingertips of those who rose early to gather the last of the beans, the squash, the apples hanging heavy from twisted branches. Women moved quietly between garden rows, skirts brushing against drying stalks, baskets slung over their arms, eyes scanning for signs of rot or frostbite on the vine. Children followed behind, dragging sacks or clutching corn cobs, their breath misting in the cool morning light. The smell of dry leaves and turned earth drifted through the air, mixed with the faint tang of smoke from chimneys that had begun to puff again in earnest. Inside the home, the hearth fire was fed steadily now, not just for warmth, but for the long hours of cooking and preserving that defined the harvest season. Apples were peeled and strung to dry from ceiling beams. Cabbages were chopped and salted into crocks for fermentation. Herbs were tied in bundles and hung upside down, their scents filling the house with sage, thyme, and rosemary. Every surface became a workspace. Every hand had a task. Time was not to be wasted. The fields, too, were alive with motion. Men moved among stalks with scythes and sacks, their backs bent, hands worn and cracked from labour. Oxen pulled carts heavy with pumpkins and gourds, wheels creaking under the load. The barns filled slowly with the fruits of months of toil, each sheaf of wheat, each barrel of corn, a small triumph against the ever-looming possibility of scarcity. There were no guarantees in colonial life, no safety nets, and the memory of hard winters past lived quietly in every adult's mind. The storage of food was both a science and a ritual. Root cellars were swept and prepared, lined with straw and sawdust to cushion delicate stores. Jars were sealed with wax. Meat was smoked in small outbuildings or salted in thick wooden barrels, layered carefully and covered with linen cloths. The process was slow, precise, and often deeply communal. Neighbours helped one another. Families might trade surplus goods or share a hog butchering day. The work spread out and made lighter by many hands. Even children took part, holding tools, fetching water, learning slowly through observation how to turn a season's bounty into winter sustenance. As the evenings lengthened and the light took on a honey-coloured hue, the interior world of colonial homes grew more important. The rhythm of labour did not stop, but shifted. Women took to spinning wheels by candlelight, their feet tapping the treadles in soft, regular motion. The hum of the wheel was constant, joined by the clack of knitting needles and the soft scraping of knives whittling wood into pegs or handles. These were the quiet hours, marked by small industry and the gentle murmurs of conversation. Stories were told, often the same ones heard a dozen times before, passed from elder to child like heirlooms, reshaped slightly with each telling. News, when it came, arrived in bundles. Letters, newspapers, travellers' accounts, all brought word of the larger world in strange bursts. A ship arrived in port, and suddenly everyone knew of a new tax, a far-off war, or the death of a monarch across the sea. These pieces of information were devoured, repeated, analysed over long evenings, their meanings debated in the dim light of a flickering flame. In towns, such news spread quickly from tavern to churchyard to marketplace, carried by word of mouth. In rural areas, it might take weeks for the same information to trickle in, by which time new events had already unfolded. Still, the hunger for news was real. It was a connection to something larger than the day's work, a reminder that though life was bounded by woods, weather, and custom, the colonies were not isolated entirely. Winter itself brought its own rituals. The first true freeze was met with a mix of awe and preparation. Windows were shuttered tightly, seams stuffed with cloth or moss. Firewood was stacked high against exterior walls, sometimes reaching the eaves. Every family had their own way of gauging how much wood was enough, but nearly all would agree it was never quite sufficient. The hearth became the centre of the home, not just symbolically, but literally. Meals were cooked over its flames, clothes dried nearby, children clustered close for warmth. Nights grew longer and darker, and dreams thicker, more vivid under heavy quilts. Snow fell, sometimes in great drifts that sealed doors shut and turned familiar paths into unrecognizable white mounds. The world shrank to the house and its outbuildings. A trip to the barn became a significant journey. Footsteps were marked with care, and tools were kept inside mittens to keep them warm enough to handle. Ice crept across the inside of windows, forming delicate patterns like feathers or frost flowers. Life slowed, but it did not stop. During these months, repairs were made to tools, garments patched, books read aloud again and again. Paper was scarce, ink dear, so writing was saved for the most important records. Bibles held pressed flowers, notes scrawled in margins, family names listed with reverence and uneven spelling. The connection to ancestry, to faith, to endurance was everywhere. Even the act of lighting a candle, saving the stub of one wick to start the next, was a lesson passed quietly from generation to generation. For many, the Sabbath remained the axis upon which the week turned. Sunday was a day of both restriction and relief. No work was to be done, save the most essential, and the day began with quiet reflection. Long walks to church in all weather, and hours of listening to sermons that blended theology, morality, and community governance. Seating was assigned. Men sat on one side, women on the other. Children were expected to be silent, still, attentive. The service was not entertainment nor escape, but reinforcement. Afterward, neighbours lingered briefly, exchanging nods or a few whispered comments before returning to their separate routines. The cold pressed inward during those weeks, and illness walked in its wake. Fevers, coughs, injuries that festered slowly in the dark, these were constant companions. There were remedies, of course, poultices and teas, prayers and isolation. But more often it was time and the strength of the body itself that determined the outcome. Death was no stranger to colonial homes. It came for children and elders alike, often without warning. Grief was private, folded into the day's work, the rhythm of life continuing even as hearts bent under the weight. But there was also celebration, quiet and modest though it may have been. A birth, a successful harvest, the return of a family member from far away. These were moments of stillness and gratitude, marked with a shared meal, a song hummed softly, a new cradle carved by hand. In all things, life in colonial America was woven from repetition, community, and a deep attentiveness to the small and the ordinary. There was no glamour, no spectacle, just the constant motion of survival, faith, and quiet hope, all unfolding beneath the changing sky and the steady ticking of a world that waited for no one. Spring in the colonies came not as a sudden burst, but as a creeping thaw, slow and deliberate, as if the land itself was waking cautiously from a long and brittle sleep. Snow melted first at the edges, along stone walls, and under south-facing eaves, dripping quietly onto the cold-packed earth below. The ground turned soft, then muddy, a thick and clinging muck that stuck to boots and hooves alike, pulling at steps and filling the air with a heavy, earthy scent. The creeks swelled with runoff, their waters cold and fast, pushing twigs and leaves downstream in a chattering rush that seemed to echo through the woods. With the thaw came labour. Fences had to be checked, repaired where winter winds had knocked down posts or loosened rails. Fields were walked, assessed, turned slowly with iron-shod ploughs that cut through the damp soil, in furrows that steamed faintly in the chill morning air. The oxen strained, thick muscles working beneath shaggy hides, while men walked beside them, boots sinking into the mire, hands gripping wooden yokes and worn leather reins. Sap was rising in the trees now, and maple tapping began in earnest. Wooden spiles were driven into trunks. Small wooden buckets hung beneath them to catch the slow, sweet drip that would later be boiled down into syrup over outdoor fires. The scent of boiling sap, sweet and smoky, drifted through the forests, mingling with the scent of thawing bark and moss and the sharp green promise of new growth. Women turned to their gardens again, fingers pressing seeds into damp soil, marking rows with small stakes, watching for the first signs of green shoots pushing upward. Indoors, the homes that had been sealed tight for months were opened slowly. Shutters pulled back, floors swept, bedding aired out in the weak sunlight. Dust danced in the beams of light slanting across rough plank walls, and the smell of wood smoke began to fade slightly, replaced by the cool freshness of spring air. Chores multiplied. Chickens began to lay more steadily, their clucking more insistent. Calves were born, lambs arrived, their bleats high and tremulous in the early mornings. Children were set to watch them, learning to move gently, to feed with care, to notice when something was wrong. Even the youngest ones had their roles, picking stones from the garden paths, gathering kindling, shooing birds from the planted beds. In towns, spring brought noise and motion. Carts rattled through streets again, loaded with goods or manure for fields. Shopkeepers opened their shutters wide, sweeping stoops, polishing brass, preparing for a season of trade. Ships returned to port bearing supplies, letters, and news. The return of a ship was a moment of great importance, drawing crowds to the docks, the scent of salt and tar thick in the air. Merchants shouted, sailors grumbled, crates thudded onto worn wooden planks. In churches, ministers gave thanks for surviving another winter, their sermons heavy with reminders of divine mercy and the need for continued diligence. Illness might have taken neighbours, livestock might have perished, but the Lord had preserved what he had seen fit to preserve. The congregation listened, some nodding solemnly, others with eyes drifting to windows, where the light played softly on the glass, casting fragile shapes onto the pews. With spring came weddings too, often delayed from winter. Young couples stood before family and neighbours in simple ceremonies. The bride's dress, perhaps her Sunday best, the groom in a coat borrowed or newly sewn. Rings were plain, vows spoken in quiet voices, followed by a modest feast if food allowed. Laughter returned cautiously to these gatherings, the kind that had lain dormant during the coldest months. Music might be played, fiddles brought out, feet tapping on wooden floors, but never too loud, never too wild. Decorum and modesty held firm, even in joy. Schooling resumed as well, where it existed. Children sat on narrow benches in one-room buildings, slates in hand, eyes flicking from teacher to window and back again. Lessons in letters, numbers, scripture. Discipline was stern, often corporal, and silence was expected unless called upon. The schoolmaster or mistress ruled the room like a ship's captain, steering the minds of the young with firm direction. Yet even here, there were moments of softness, a kind word, a warm fire, the thrill of mastering a new word or cipher. As the days lengthened, life expanded outward. Paths that had been impassable were travelled again. Visits resumed between homesteads. Letters were sent. Goods were exchanged. The colony stirred with motion once more, and the quiet that had settled over them like a blanket in winter was slowly folded back, revealing a landscape both familiar and subtly changed. Trees budded, blossoms opened, birds returned with new songs that echoed through the forests and across open fields. The blue sky seemed impossibly wide after months of grey, and the warmth on one's face felt like a blessing. Yet for all the change, much remained the same. The work, the worry, the slow unfolding of survival, the routines sharpened by necessity, the awareness of how little separated comfort from hardship. Even joy was tempered by caution. A late frost could undo weeks of planting. A neighbour's illness could turn to death in a matter of days. These realities hummed beneath the surface of every cheerful moment, giving colonial life its particular texture, one of beauty edged with brittleness. Still, people laughed, they sang, they loved. They built anew what winter had broken. They gathered in fields for communal tasks, mending fences together, raising barns, tilling shared plots. The community pulsed with quiet interdependence. One family's misfortune could ripple outward, just as their success might lift others. The ties between neighbours were not always warm, but they were strong. As twilight came earlier again, with summer on the horizon, candles were lit less out of need and more from habit. The air inside homes grew less stuffy, the breeze from open windows carrying in scents of grass and flowering trees. Meals grew fresher, with greens from the garden, eggs, fresh milk, maybe even a few early berries if one was lucky and attentive. Sleep came still and deep, bodies tired from renewed labour, hearts lightened slightly by the return of birdsong and green things. And above it all, the sky arched wide and blue, untroubled by the quiet toil below. Summer settled over the colonies like a warm woolen blanket, heavy and unrelenting, wrapping towns and countryside alike in its slow, humid grip. The sun rose early, gilding the tops of trees and the roofs of wooden homes with a soft, golden haze. And by mid-morning, the air grew thick and buzzing with flies, the hum of insects rising and falling like a lazy hymn. Sweat gathered quickly beneath linen collars and the wide brims of straw hats, soaking the backs of necks and the seams of sleeves, and every task became slower, more deliberate, as bodies adjusted to the weight of the heat. Fields baked beneath a sun that gave no mercy, and men worked steadily despite it, ploughing, hoeing, harvesting early crops, their brows damp, shirts clinging to their backs. Corn grew tall and rustled in the breeze, its silken tassels swaying gently. Beans twined up rough wooden poles, their leaves broad and green. Squash plants sprawled across garden beds, their yellow flowers curling open in the light. Children were set to weeding and gathering herbs, chasing off birds, carrying water from wells in heavy wooden buckets with iron handles that pressed into their palms. In the woods, berries ripened, black and red, staining fingers and tongues. Some were gathered in baskets lined with leaves, destined for pies or preserves. Others were eaten on the spot, warm from the sun, sweet and fleeting. The forest itself was thick with life now. Cicadas shrilled from high branches, and birds called from the canopy. Deer moved quietly through the underbrush, their hooves silent on pine needles. Every living thing responded to the long days and warm nights with a quiet fervour, a breathless fullness. Inside, households adapted. Windows were opened wide and propped with sticks, shutters pulled back, hoping for cross breezes that might stir the hot, still air. Linen was dampened and hung across doorways. Water was carried constantly, for drinking, for cooking, for cooling pots and soaking cloths. The hearth fire, still necessary for meals, was now carefully tended to avoid overheating the home. Meals themselves grew simpler. Fresh bread, cold milk, sliced cucumbers, stewed beans, and pickled vegetables became staples. If meat was eaten, it was often boiled to avoid frying in the heat. Cider, weak beer, and well water were drunk in quantity, the jugs passed around in the shade. The smells of sweat, livestock, and damp earth mingled with those of cooking greens and summer herbs, creating a thick, living aroma that clung to clothes and walls alike. In towns, The streets grew busier. Market days bustled with motion as people arrived from the countryside bearing baskets of produce, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth, bundles of herbs, and bolts of homespun. Artisans displayed their wares, shoes with leather laces, iron tools, soap, candles, combs carved from bone. The sun beat down on the wooden stalls and wagons, and buyers moved slowly between them, squinting beneath broad-brimmed hats, bartering softly, swatting at flies with strips of horsehair. The air was filled with the smell of bodies, horses, bread, manure, and the tang of vinegar from pickled goods. Nearby, children might be playing in the dust with simple toys, hoops and sticks, or watching with wide eyes as a travelling peddler unfolded his cases of pins, ribbons, and trinkets from faraway ports. News travelled quickly in such gatherings. A fire in a neighbouring settlement, a sickness spreading through livestock, a new tax from the crown, or a skirmish with a distant tribe, all whispered from one mouth to another until the whole crowd knew, or thought they knew, the full shape of the event. Then the carts rolled away, the dust settled, and quiet returned. Life in colonial America was rich with repetition and routine, but not without its special days. In summer, there might be a fair or a muster, where the local militia gathered to drill in formation, muskets slung over shoulders, drums beating a slow rhythm. Men stood in lines, sweating beneath wool uniforms, while children and wives watched from shaded spots, passing water jugs and fanning their faces with bonnets. The day might end with a small feast, bread and smoked fish, pies, perhaps a bit of song. Not celebration exactly, but a pause, a breath in the long labour of the year. Religious observances continued, woven into every season. Summer sermons were often long and stern, with open windows framing the leafy trees outside. Parishioners dozed discreetly, heads nodding, fans waving slowly. The heat made everyone sluggish, even the ministers, but the words still carried weight. Morality, obedience, diligence, these were the pillars of community. Afterward, families lingered outside the meeting house, exchanging news and small courtesies before. Returning home for a midday meal and perhaps a short rest before the evening's chores, nightfall brought some relief, the air cooling slightly as the sun slipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over fences and fields. Fireflies emerged, blinking among the tall grasses, and frogs called from the edges of ponds. Families gathered on porches or near open windows, speaking quietly, mending, shelling peas, darning socks. The day slowed, stretched, settled. Indoors, candles were lit again, their soft glow flickering on wooden walls, while insects tapped at the glass or buzzed lazily near the flame. Sleep came later in summer, the body resisting rest in the warmth, but eventually even the busiest minds grew quiet. Beds were shared as always, children curled together, limbs tangled, adults sinking into straw mattresses with groans of tired satisfaction. Through the open shutters came the sound of crickets, the sighing of trees, the occasional bark of a distant dog, or the faint rustle of raccoons near the hen house. Summer nights held their own kind of silence, not empty, but full, layered with soft life, the breathing of the land itself. Yet always the next day arrived. The rooster crowed. The fire was lit. Water was fetched. Bread was kneaded. Letters were written. Fields were walked. And the long, slow days of colonial summer continued their quiet unfolding, tethered to the soil and the sky, to the needs of the body and the rhythms of the earth, woven tightly into the fabric of a life that was not simple, but deeply rooted in the ordinary and the enduring. The colonial household, regardless of size or station, was a world unto itself, filled with motion and purpose from the moment light touched the windows to the last ember curling in the hearth at night. It was not merely a shelter, but a workshop, a schoolroom, a hospital, a kitchen, and often a place of business. Within its timbered walls, lives unfolded in cycles as predictable as the seasons, bound to chores that were relentless in their regularity. Floors were swept daily with bundles of tied twigs or straw, the same motion repeated in long, slow strokes that sent up little clouds of dust and bits of straw, caught briefly in shafts of sun. Windows, when they existed, were kept clean with rags dipped in vinegar and water. Fireplaces were raked, ashes collected in buckets and used to make lye for soap. Beds were remade each morning, sheets shaken out, blankets smoothed, straw tickings fluffed and turned. Every object had a place, and every place a purpose. In this world, the work of women was both endless and largely invisible to those who did not perform it. From early childhood, girls were taught the small and precise rituals of maintenance, how to sew seams that would hold under years of wear, how to preserve fruits against the mould, how to stir a pot without letting it scorch, how to twist flax into linen thread with even tension. They learned to judge heat without thermometers, to bake by feel and smell, to gauge the readiness of a jam or a pie crust, or a bundle of herbs hung to dry. Boys likewise learned by watching. They were given small tools, shown how to plane a board, drive a nail, clean a musket, split wood with a steady hand and a solid stance. Apprenticeship began at home, long before any formal training. Fathers passed knowledge to sons not through instruction, but through demonstration, through a steady stream of daily tasks in which participation was the only entry point to understanding. The tools of life were kept close. Wooden buckets were scrubbed and hung neatly. Iron pots were blackened with soot but well cared for, their handles oiled to prevent rust. Brooms were bound anew when worn. Clothes were patched and repatched until fabric could no longer hold a stitch. Nothing was discarded lightly. Even candle stubs were melted down, reformed, used again. A broken dish might be sealed with resin or lead. A cracked tool handle would be mended, wrapped, repaired with wire. Waste was a luxury no one could afford. Lighting was dim and precious. Candles were made from tallow or beeswax, dipped by hand in repeated passes until thick enough to stand upright. They were trimmed carefully to avoid waste, used sparingly, and snuffed with care. Lamps burned oil pressed from flaxseed or animal fat. Their flickering light cast long shadows on the walls, and entire rooms were shaped around its reach. Reading, when it happened, occurred near the fire or beneath the cleanest window, eyes squinting at small print. Books were rare, and those that existed were often religious in nature. Bibles, catechisms, collections of sermons. Occasionally, a volume of poetry or a collection of almanacs. These were read aloud, slowly, with reverence. Pages were turned with clean hands. Margins were sometimes annotated in careful script, a record not just of thoughts but of ownership, inheritance, use. Clothing was not merely worn, it was maintained. Most garments were made at home or locally by seamstresses or tailors. Linen shirts, woolen breeches, bodices, petticoats, all sewn by hand, dyed with plants, washed in cold water with lye soap, and dried in the sun. Ironing, when it occurred, was done with heavy irons heated by the fire, pressed with effort and caution. Clothes were aired, brushed, mended. A good pair of shoes might last years if cared for properly. Leather was oiled and softened, soles re-nailed or stitched. Even undergarments, plain and coarse, were valued possessions, not disposable, but preserved. Personal hygiene, by modern standards, was minimal, but methodical. Faces were washed with cold water in the morning, sometimes with a bit of vinegar added. Teeth were rubbed with cloths or brushed with twigs. Soap was homemade, harsh on skin, but used when available. Baths were rare and often communal within a household, water heated in pots and poured into wooden tubs. The same water might be used for more than one person, from eldest to youngest. Hair was combed daily, lice checked for, braids redone, caps adjusted. Perfume and powder were rarities, mostly reserved for the wealthier or for special occasions. Most people smelled of smoke, earth, wool and labour. The colonial home was also a place of healing, however modest. When illness struck, it was managed within the household first. A scratch was cleaned with. Spirits, covered with a cloth dipped in honey or tallow. A cough was treated with herbal teas, onion syrup, or a poultice of mustard seed. Fevers were sweated out under blankets with vinegar compresses or strong-smelling tonics. Knowledge of plants was vital. Chamomile, yarrow, horehound, mint, willow bark. These were not luxuries, but necessities. Women especially were expected to know their uses, their doses, the dangers. Some families kept small herb gardens, others foraged. Medical care, when sought, was often distant, costly, or rudimentary. A travelling doctor might bring leeches, bleeding bowls, tinctures, and sharp knives. Most preferred to rely on what they knew, what they had, what had worked before. Births took place in bedrooms, attended by neighbours, midwives, and occasionally a physician if one was near. Deaths occurred quietly, in beds or barns or fields, the body washed and wrapped by family, laid out in the parlour, the clock stopped, mirrors covered, prayers said. These rituals were sombre but unadorned. There was little room for extravagance, only the comfort of tradition and presence. The home, in all its simplicity, was a place of continuity. Generations lived under the same roof. Grandparents told stories by the fire while children played at their feet. Meals were shared, chores divided, decisions made collectively. There was little privacy, few secrets, and even fewer indulgences. Yet in the rhythm of the domestic space, there was also a deep sense of stability. It was a world people knew, shaped and passed on. A world built slowly by hands, warmed by breath, illuminated by flame, and worn smooth by time. In the layered texture of colonial life, the village green or town centre held a quiet but persistent importance, not only as a place of commerce or religious gathering, but as a subtle pulse point around which the wider rhythms of society moved. The green was not necessarily green in colour, often a dusty common patch of trampled earth ringed by wooden buildings, but it was where neighbours met, where messages were read aloud from posts nailed to trees or boards, where fines were announced and public matters discussed with a formality just shy of ceremony. In larger towns, there might be stocks or a whipping post at the edge of the green, sober reminders of order and consequence, their presence unspoken but deeply understood. The soundscape of such places was distinct, the murmur of voices softened by distance, the clop of hooves on packed dirt, the occasional creak of wagon wheels, or the metallic strike of a blacksmith's hammer somewhere nearby. And above it all, the quiet hush of expectation, as if the place itself was listening. Markets, fairs, militia drills, sermons and notices, all unfolded here. Announcements of marriage bans, land sales, runaway indentured servants, or new arrivals from distant ports were often pinned to trees or the church door. These papers, hand-lettered and damp with ink, were read with interest, passed around, discussed in hushed voices. The arrival of the post rider was an event, bringing with him not only letters but fragments of the outside world. News from Boston, rumours from London, stories of strange happenings in the Caribbean or the Carolinas. The post was not daily, not even weekly in some places, and it moved at the pace of weather and roads, subject to delay from storms, broken wheels, or swollen rivers. Still, when he came, eyes followed him, and ears leaned in close. Along the edges of town, small businesses operated in spaces that were often part of a household. A shoemaker's bench might sit beside the family's dining table. A weaver's loom might share space with a cradle and a basket of kindling. Commerce and domesticity blurred easily. General stores, where they existed, carried an eclectic mix of goods: molasses in barrels, nails in sacks, ribbons, tobacco, lamp oil, spices, imported cloth, sometimes books or almanacs. Goods were measured and poured, wrapped in paper, tied with twine. Bartering remained common. A few eggs might be traded for pins. A length of wool might buy a jar of honey. Coin was rare in the countryside, and credit, built on trust and reputation, was the true currency of exchange. The tavern, another central fixture, served as both a gathering place and a vital node in the colony's loose network of information. With its low ceilings, wide hearth and heavy beams, it offered warmth and shelter to travellers and locals alike. Inside, the air was thick with pipe smoke, the smell of ale and sweat, the murmur of conversation that ebbed and flowed with the hour. Travellers brought tales from afar, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes hard-won, and these were traded like gold across tables sticky with spilled drink. Games of cards or dice were played quietly, eyes flicking to the door for signs of authority. Taverns were not wild or loud, but they were social in a cautious, deliberate way. Here, a blacksmith might sip cider beside a preacher, or a farmer discuss harvests with a trader newly arrived from Philadelphia. Women rarely entered these spaces, unless to deliver something or pass through, and their absence shaped the tone. These were male-dominated spheres, shaped by status and familiarity, where words were measured and remembered. Education, when available, clung closely to these communal places. Schoolhouses stood not far from greens or meeting houses, small one-room structures with shuttered windows and narrow doors. Within, students sat on benches with slates on their laps, the room smelling of ink, chalk, and dust. Lessons were recited aloud, often in unison, a chorus of young voices chanting letters, psalms, or arithmetic tables. The rod was close at hand, and silence was a discipline learned early. Girls and boys alike learned to read, at least enough to manage scripture and simple accounts. Writing was less common, more expensive to teach, requiring paper and ink. Higher education, if pursued, required travel and money, and was most often reserved for sons of wealthier families, perhaps those bound for the clergy or the law. The role of religion remained ever present. The church, usually the most substantial building in town, often stood on or near the green. Its bell was not just a call to worship, but a signal for meetings, emergencies, or celebrations. Services were long, austere, with sermons that pressed hard upon sin, duty, and community. Ministers held significant influence, their words shaping not just spiritual lives, but moral and civic ones. Church attendance was expected, and absences noted. Doctrine varied between regions: Puritan in New England, Anglican in the South, Quaker in Pennsylvania. but the structure of religious life was always woven into the fabric of the week. Beyond the green, justice was administered in measured doses. Small courts met in taverns or town halls, presided over by local men who knew both the law and the people it governed. Offences ranged from theft to blasphemy, drunkenness to neglect of the Sabbath. Punishments were public and physical. Fines posted for all to see, stocks used without drama, lashes delivered with calm precision. The goal was not spectacle but correction, and the community was expected to witness it all. Crime was not abstract, it had names, faces and consequences. Yet with all this order, life retained a certain looseness. Boundaries between town and country, public and private, were porous. A man might serve on the militia and shoe horses. A woman might keep bees and teach letters. Skills were layered and practical, not specialized. People knew each other's strengths and failings. Gossip moved as swiftly as fire, curling through kitchens and across fences, shaping reputations in ways both petty and profound. Honour mattered, not in a grand romantic sense, but in the slow accumulation of choices. How one paid debts, treated neighbours, kept promises. These small acts, repeated over years, defined a person's place in the delicate lattice of colonial life. And so the green, dusty or muddy or sunlit, remained at the heart of it all. Children played around its edges, under watchful eyes. Dogs barked and chickens clucked near its borders. Announcements were posted, justice was served, worship was called, and beneath the surface, the quiet machinery of community turned, steady, cautious, familiar, carrying with it the weight of many lives moving in concert, however slowly, through the long and careful days of early America. Travel in colonial America was rarely a matter of leisure, and almost never of comfort, undertaken with careful planning and a deep patience for delays, discomforts, and uncertainty. The roads, if they could be called that, were often little more than widened animal trails or cleared forest paths, rutted and uneven, choked with mud in spring, dust in summer, and snow or ice in winter. Stones jutted from the ground like bones, and tree roots clung just beneath the soil waiting to jolt the wheels of carts and carriages. Most travel was done on foot or horseback, the latter requiring not only the animal, but the knowledge and strength to ride for hours without saddle sores or strain. A single journey between towns that might seem neighbouring on a modern map could take days, with stops at crude inns or roadside taverns offering straw mattresses, hard bread, and whatever stew might be boiling over the hearth that day. These establishments were neither luxurious nor particularly clean, and guests might share their bed with strangers, lice, or the scurrying feet of mice overhead. Yet they were essential, dotted like beads across the rough trails, waypoints for mail riders, tradesmen, and weary families moving toward new parcels of land. Wagons and carts were used when possible, but they moved slowly, with wheels groaning and axles creaking under the weight of goods, barrels, tools, and passengers. A broken wheel or lost horse could turn a journey of hours into one of days, and travellers carried tools, rope, spare parts, and food in preparation for such events. River crossings were another matter entirely. Ferries, when available, were pulled across by rope or poled by hand, slow and deliberate. In more rural areas, travellers forded streams and rivers at shallow points, lifting garments, holding on to reins, watching the water swirl around their knees with cautious eyes. Bridges were rare, sometimes little more than planks laid over stones, and they were vulnerable to flood, frost, and rot. Those who lived near rivers understood the temperament of the water, its moods and dangers, and passed this knowledge on quietly from parent to child. Coastal travel, especially in the mid-Atlantic and southern colonies, was often easier by water. Boats, canoes, and small coastal vessels ferried people and cargo between settlements, moving along bays, inlets, and rivers where roads were impassable or non-existent. The waterways were both highways and lifelines, connecting farms and towns to the broader trade networks of the colonies. The sails of small schooners could be seen against the horizon, gliding slowly with the wind, their holds filled with barrels of tobacco, dried fish, timber, or imported cloth. The smell of tar, salt, and wet rope clung to these journeys, along with the constant creak of timbers and the cry of gulls wheeling overhead. On land, travel was often undertaken for necessity, trading goods, visiting distant family, delivering news, or seeking medical care. Weddings and funerals brought people from far away, arriving over days or even weeks, carrying stories and food and worn letters. Court appearances, militia duties, or religious convocations might also draw individuals from surrounding settlements. The idea of travel as pleasure, as a pursuit of novelty or scenery, was foreign to most. The world was large and slow to cross, and every mile came with effort. Maps were rare, directions passed orally, measured in landmarks rather than distances. A traveller might be told to ride until they saw the bent oak, then turn left at the stream with the flat stones, pass 2 farms, and ask again at the next crossroads. Memory, intuition, and observation were the tools of navigation. Compasses were prized but not common, and the stars themselves were a guide for those who knew how to read them. Along the way, travellers might encounter native peoples, other settlers, enslaved labourers, escaped servants, or wandering animals. The land was shared, though unequally, and interactions ranged from wary nods to bartered goods to tensions unspoken but deeply felt. A lone traveller might ride past fields where enslaved people laboured beneath the sun, their presence both silent and visible, a constant reminder of the system that underpinned much of the economy, particularly in the South. These fields stretched far in places, neat rows of tobacco or cotton or rice, tended under the eye of an overseer, while the big house loomed in the distance, framed by oak and sycamore. In smaller farms and frontier outposts, travel brought news of the world beyond the woods. A letter from a cousin in Massachusetts, a sermon printed in Boston, a newspaper wrapped around spices from the Indies. Each item told a story. A visiting preacher might bring a new style of prayer, a merchant, a new pattern of cloth, a soldier, tales of distant skirmishes or foreign customs. Travel brought friction and change, tiny shifts in habit or belief, passed from hand to hand like smoothed stones. The travellers themselves returned with changed eyes, a new word, a new mannerism, a slightly different way of seeing the familiar. For women, travel was more limited and more precarious. A journey undertaken alone was rare and often frowned upon, requiring letters of introduction, trusted escorts, or clear purpose. Still, women travelled to help at births, attend to dying kin, relocate after marriage, or assist with seasonal harvests. They did so in long dresses, with bundled skirts and shawls, carrying small satchels and enduring the same bumps, delays, and dangers as any man, but often with less recognition. Their movement was quieter, less recorded, but no less significant. Children, too, experienced travel as a slow unfolding. They rode beside parents, clinging to saddles, lulled to sleep by the jolt of wheels or the sway of a horse's gait. They watched the land pass, absorbing the changing shape of trees, the scent of unfamiliar soil, the difference in accents from one region to another. Travel taught patience and observation, humility before nature's scale. It revealed the spread of settlement, the space between hearths, the tenuous string that connected one home to another. When they returned, they did so with stories, small treasures, or new ideas tucked into their minds like seeds. And so travel, though rare, threaded through the colonial world like a slow winding river, shaping its borders, shifting its people, carrying with it not just goods and news, but memory, influence, and the quiet, steady motion of connection. Education in colonial America was a quietly layered affair, deeply dependent on region, religion, wealth, and gender, shaped more by the values of the community than by any central authority, and often conducted not in stately institutions or formal schools, but within the uneven walls of private homes, small meeting houses, or one-room schoolhouses built by collective effort. In New England, where Puritan influence ran deep, literacy was seen as a moral duty, not merely a practical skill. The ability to read scripture, to engage directly with the Word of God, was tied closely to salvation itself, and so reading instruction was prioritized for both boys and girls from an early age. A child might begin with a horn book, a flat piece of wood or bone with a printed sheet of letters, syllables, and simple prayers covered by a thin sheet of horn, worn smooth by repeated use. These horn books were often tied to the belt or carried in the pocket, and lessons were recited aloud, often in sing-song, until the letters became familiar shapes and the prayers instinctive murmurs. The New England primer followed, filled with moral lessons and alphabet rhymes laced with religious warnings. A is for Adam's fall, B is for the Bible, and so on, each page a blend of fear and instruction. Teachers in these early schools were often men, though women taught in dame schools, especially in towns where formal schooling was sparse or out of reach. Dame schools were held in kitchens or parlours, small clusters of children seated on stools near the hearth, learning their letters while the day's baking or mending continued around them. The instruction was basic, focused on reading and perhaps some writing or arithmetic, but it was foundational, and the atmosphere was one of gentle insistence rather than strict discipline. Still, rules were enforced, and discipline could be stern, with birch rods or switches used to correct wandering minds or unruly behaviour. In the middle and southern colonies, education varied more widely. Towns were fewer and farther between, and many children were taught at home, if at all. Tutors might be hired by wealthy families to instruct their children in Latin, Greek, mathematics, and the classics, preparing boys for university or the ministry. Girls in these households were often taught to read and write, but also trained in the household arts, needlework, music, the keeping of ledgers, and the management of servants or slaves. The line between intellectual and practical education blurred, with skills taught according to the presumed future role of the student. For boys, that might mean trade, ministry, or leadership. For girls, it meant marriage, motherhood, and the management of a household. Still, not all girls were excluded from deeper learning. In Quaker communities, for example, there was more emphasis on equal education, and girls might receive the same instruction as their brothers, including the study of history, science, and moral philosophy. Books themselves were precious, passed from hand to hand, read and reread until pages were thin at the corners. A family Bible, often the largest and most ornate book in the home, might contain pressed flowers, handwritten notes, family records, and marginalia tracing the thoughts and prayers of generations. Almanacs were also common, their pages filled with weather predictions, planting schedules, recipes, and wise sayings. They were both instructional and entertaining, providing practical knowledge alongside small amusements. In more urban areas, printing presses churned out pamphlets, sermons, and broadsheets, and the ability to read meant access to a growing world of ideas, arguments, and information. Children's education rarely included structured play or creative expression, though both emerged naturally in small moments. Songs learned by rote, small verses invented, stories whispered at the edge of sleep. Formal examinations were rare. Progress was measured by recitation, by the ability to copy passages neatly, to solve sums on a slate, or to memorize scripture. Writing was taught last and with care, as ink and paper were costly. A child might first trace letters in sand or on a wooden board before graduating to quills and parchment. The skill of writing, of forming letters with uniformity, of composing a letter or keeping a ledger, was both technical and artistic, and it was practiced slowly, each stroke deliberate. For enslaved people, education was almost entirely forbidden by law in many colonies, especially in the South, where fear of rebellion and the belief in racial inferiority led to prohibitions on teaching enslaved individuals to read or write. Still, knowledge found its way through whispered instruction, shared scripture, or the slow passing of oral tradition. In some northern colonies, free black children might receive limited education through church-sponsored schools, but access remained narrow and the quality uneven. The divide between who could learn and who could teach was etched deeply into the social structure, a reflection of power and fear. Higher education, such as it was, remained the domain of the privileged. Harvard, founded in 1636, was followed by William and Mary, Yale, and others, institutions built to train ministers and civic leaders. The curriculum leaned heavily on classical languages, theology, logic, and rhetoric, taught by lecture and recitation. The students were male, young, and often preparing for roles in church or government. These colleges were small, austere, and deeply tied to religious authority, their libraries modest but valued. Still, within them, seeds of broader thought were planted, discussions of rights, governance, science, and the natural world that would one day ripple outward. Outside the schoolroom, the land itself was a kind of teacher. Children learned the names of plants, the habits of animals, the ways of weather and soil. They observed how tools were made, how bread rose, how wounds healed or failed to. Curiosity lived in the margins, watching a blacksmith at work, asking why certain herbs were boiled, noting how the stars moved across the night sky. Education, in its fullest sense, was not only about books, but about attention. A colonial child learned by doing, by listening, by helping, by failing, by repeating. It was a quiet, constant process, shaped by environment and necessity, unfolding not in grades or tests, but in competence, in trust, in the gentle passing of knowledge from hand to hand, from one worn life into the next. Food in colonial America was not merely a matter of sustenance, but a quiet, daily negotiation with the land, the seasons, and the limitations of storage, tools, and time. The preparation of a single meal began long before the fire was lit, beneath the iron pot, rooted in weeks or even months of planting, gathering, preserving, and planning. There were no supermarkets, no rapid substitutions. Every ingredient had a season, and meals were built around what was available, not what was desired. A pot of stew on a cold day was not a recipe followed, but a culmination of what remained in the root cellar, what hung from the rafters, what could be pulled from the soil or fetched from the hen house that morning. In the kitchens of colonial homes, be they grand or humble, the hearth was the centre, wide and deep, with a swinging arm to hold pots and an array of hooks, cranes and trammels for managing heat. The fire was kept burning from dawn to dusk, stoked with care, its embers carefully arranged to boil, to roast, to bake or to warm. Nearby, a large wooden table held cutting boards, knives worn thin from years of use, a butter churn, a mortar and pestle, bundles of dried herbs, and bowls carved from wood or moulded from clay. Bread was the anchor of most meals. In towns, some households might send their dough to a communal bake oven, but in rural homes, loaves were often baked in cast iron Dutch ovens, buried in hot coals and covered with embers. The flour used depended on geography and economy. Wheat, where it could be grown or afforded, but more commonly cornmeal, rye, or a mixture. Cornbread, spoonbread, hoe cakes, and ash cakes filled bellies across the colonies, often accompanied by broth or beans. Yeast was not always available, and leavening relied on sourdough starters or natural fermentation, a skill passed from mother to daughter. Porridge was another staple, made from oats, cornmeal or barley, simmered slowly with milk or water, and flavoured with a bit of molasses, salt or herbs. It was eaten hot in the morning or cold the next day, sometimes fried into cakes. Vegetables were consumed in large quantities when available. Cabbage, onions, squash, carrots, turnips and beans, either stewed together or added to whatever meat could be spared. In the warmer months, fresh greens like dandelion, spinach and sorrel were foraged and tossed into pottage, their bright, bitter flavours a welcome contrast to the winter's preserved fare. In the colder months, these were replaced by pickled or dried versions, rehydrated in stews and soups that simmered for hours. Meat was prized but not guaranteed. Chickens were common, though often kept more for their eggs than their meat. A hen that stopped laying might find its way into the pot, tough and stringy, unless cooked slowly with root vegetables and herbs. Pigs were more common than cattle in many regions, easier to feed and quicker to mature. A single hog slaughter in the fall would provide meat for months, salted, smoked, rendered into lard, and preserved in brine. Sausages were made with scraps, spiced and packed into cleaned intestines, hung from the rafters to dry or smoked over hickory or applewood. Beef, when available, was also preserved in salt, as fresh meat would spoil quickly without ice or refrigeration. Wild game supplemented many tables. Venison, rabbit, squirrel, wild turkey, and even raccoon were caught, dressed and cooked depending on the season and the skill of the hunter. Fish was vital in coastal and riverine areas. Cod, shad, perch, eels, caught in traps or with lines, then fried, baked or dried. Shellfish like oysters and clams were gathered in large quantities, sometimes baked in pies or stewed with milk and onions. Spices were rare and expensive, but when they could be found, they were used sparingly. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg and pepper measured in careful pinches, stored in small boxes and prized like coins. Salt was essential, often harvested from seawater by evaporation or purchased in heavy sacks. Vinegar served as both preservative and seasoning. Sweeteners, too, were limited. White sugar was expensive and imported, but molasses, a byproduct of Caribbean sugar refining, was more widely available and used in everything from gingerbread to beans. Honey was harvested locally when bees were kept, and maple syrup offered a seasonal alternative in the northern colonies. Beverages were simple. Water was not always clean, so small beer, weak fermented, low in alcohol, was the common drink, consumed by children and adults alike. Cider, both sweet and hard, was ubiquitous, made from apples gathered and pressed in the fall, stored in barrels in cool cellars. In wealthier homes, tea and coffee might appear, but these were luxury goods, often subject to taxes and smuggled trade. The ritual of tea drinking was both social and political, particularly in cities like Boston, where protest brewed alongside the leaves. Meals were taken in shifts or together, depending on the size and structure of the household. Breakfast might be early and light, porridge or bread and milk. Dinner, served midday, was the main meal, hearty, hot, the result of hours of labour. Supper was lighter, perhaps leftover stew or cold meat with bread. Meals were not rushed, but neither were they lingered over. They were necessary breaks in the labour of the day, moments of shared sustenance and quiet conversation. Children learned early to eat what was given, to waste nothing, to chew with mouths closed, and to thank the cook. Special occasions brought changes to the table. Weddings, harvests, and holidays like Christmas or Thanksgiving were marked with richer foods, roasted fowl, pies filled with preserved fruit or meat, sweet puddings made from eggs and cream. These were not everyday indulgences, but celebratory exceptions, made possible by the careful saving and planning that preceded them. Pies were both savoury and sweet, with crusts that were more utilitarian than flaky, often serving as a container for fillings that varied by season. Food was survival, but it was also memory, tradition, and identity. Recipes were not written, but remembered, passed by word and demonstration, adapted to what the land offered and what the year allowed. The hands that chopped, stirred, kneaded, and served did so not for show, but for life. And in that daily rhythm of preparation, of shared bowls and steaming pots, of hearths glowing and kettles hissing softly, the heartbeat of colonial America was quietly and steadily sustained. Night in colonial America did not fall so much as gather, slowly, like a heavy wool cloak draped over the shoulders of the land, its edges seeping into the corners of homes, into the creases of fields, into the spaces between trees where the last birds gave their final chirps before silence. Without electricity, the transition from day to night was not marked by a switch, but by an ever-deepening dimness, the golden light of sunset shifting to a blue twilight, and then to the thick ink of full darkness, lit only by flame and starlight. Homes glowed faintly from within, the flicker of tallow candles casting soft, dancing shadows across the walls, elongating the shapes of chairs, baskets, spinning wheels, and people moving quietly about their evening tasks. The air cooled, often bringing relief after the labours of the day, and windows were closed or covered as the chill crept in. Doors were barred not from fear, but from habit, a final gesture of containment, of keeping the night out and the warmth in. Supper dishes were cleaned, leftover bread covered, pots emptied and scrubbed. The hearth was banked carefully, embers pushed together and covered with ash to keep them smouldering until morning. Tools were hung back on their pegs, shoes left near the door, garments folded. The last of the day's chores were done in near silence, interrupted only by the crackle of fire or the creak of wood expanding and settling as temperatures fell. Beds were prepared, straw tickings shaken and fluffed, blankets straightened, quilts pulled tight to the edges. Children were guided to their places, sometimes sharing mattresses laid across the floor or nestled into corners, wrapped together like bundles. Adults followed soon after, though not always to sleep. evening was one of the few times for uninterrupted conversation, for hushed reflection, for mending clothes or writing letters by candlelight. Quills scratched across rough paper, the ink thick and slow to dry. Pages were held near the fire to warm the wax that sealed them. Letters carried thoughts that could not be spoken aloud across distance, folded tightly, addressed with careful script, and set aside to be sent with the next passing traveller. For those who could read, a book might be opened, the words illuminated in flickering light, sentences read slowly aloud to others, each phrase a small shared world. The Bible was often the centerpiece of such readings, its verses both comfort and lesson. Psalms were recited in soft voices, sometimes sung, the sound echoing faintly in the stillness of the room. Children's eyes drooped and heads nodded as verses became lullabies. In some homes, prayers were said aloud before bed, thanking God for the day's protection, asking guidance for tomorrow, mentioning neighbours, kin, or those sick or far away. These words were not elaborate but familiar, repeated night after night until they became the natural rhythm of rest. The night, however, was not entirely restful. It was long and alive with small disturbances. In the deepest hours, when the moon rode high and the silence settled thickest, there were the sounds of wind in the trees, animals shifting in barns, the distant howl of dogs or the high call of owls, creaks in the rafters, the rustle of thatch or shingles, the occasional cough from another room, the cry of an infant, the shuffle of feet rising to check on them, to hush them, to feed them in the dark. Some rose in the night for what was called the first sleep, stayed awake for an hour or two in the stillness, then returned to bed. This segmented sleep was not uncommon, a time for reflection, quiet tasks, or simply lying still and listening. Dreams were vivid and sometimes troubling, shaped by hard days, uncertain futures, and lingering fears. Superstitions lived quietly in these hours. The belief that spirits moved in the dark, that omens whispered in the night wind, that dreams could portend sickness or fortune. Charms might be kept near the bed, herbs hung above the door, shoes turned sideways to confuse evil spirits. These habits persisted even alongside strong Christian belief, woven into daily life not as contradiction but as custom, deep-rooted and unexamined. In the countryside, night brought a different silence. No sounds of neighbours, no distant footfalls, just the constant presence of nature breathing. Frogs in the marshes, insects in the trees, the occasional snap of a twig beneath a deer's foot. Those living on isolated farms felt the vastness of the land most acutely at night, the distance between them and the next household, the immense sky above dotted with stars that shimmered cold and clear. In towns, the dark was interrupted more often. Lanterns flickered outside taverns, footsteps echoed on cobbled streets. Night. Watchmen passed, calling the hour and checking for fire or mischief. Their voices carried through alleys and under shutters, a reminder that not all slept. Some worked through the night, bakers rising early to knead dough, midwives attending births, ill bodies being watched over in quiet vigil. For enslaved people, night offered a rare sliver of privacy, of rest, or of planning. Whispers passed in the shadows. Songs hummed low, memories shared. In the shadows of quarters or cabins, families clung to one another, speaking of freedom, kin, stories from elders, fragments of languages lost. The night was not a refuge, but a space between burdens. When morning approached, it did so gradually. The dark did not vanish, it thinned. First a faint greyness at the window, the outline of the chimney visible against the sky, the coals in the hearth stirring back to life with the first breath of motion. A rooster called, slow and uncertain, testing the silence. A dog shifted, the sounds of footsteps above or beside, the stirring of water being fetched. And so the day began again. The tasks were familiar, unchanged, but not meaningless. Every day was another step, another breath in the long, slow rhythm of survival and community. And when each night came again, it carried with it the same soft descent into quiet. A stillness not of absence, but of return. Not the end of motion, but its gentle pause. The darkness welcomed, the bed familiar, the fire low, the hands folded, the world tucked in beneath its vast sky, holding its breath in the calm that only night could bring.